August 12, 2000. A Russian nuclear submarine is torn apart during a training exercise. 118 men aboard. Within hours, Russian officials point to a collision with a foreign submarine. The United States denies any involvement. This is the story of the Kursk submarine disaster. By the end of this video, you'll know what the physical evidence revealed and why, more than 2 decades later, the question of what sank the Kursk is still debated. The K-141 Kursk was a Project 949A Ante-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine. NATO designation, Oscar II. She was one of the largest attack submarines ever constructed. Length, 154 meters, longer than a football field. Submerged displacement, roughly 24,000 tons. 2 OK-650 nuclear reactors. 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. A formidable weapon designed to challenge American carrier battle groups. But to understand why the Kursk was operating in the condition she was in on August 12, 2000, you have to understand what had happened to the Russian submarine fleet in the decade before.
He then officially resigned as president of the Soviet Union and turned over the nuclear codes to the new top man, Russia's Boris Yeltsin.
The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and with it, the Navy that had once fielded over 200 submarines saw its funding collapse. Budget cuts forced boats into port. Rusting submarines crowded Northern Fleet docks. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the Soviet submarine force deployed as many as 200 boats. By the end of the 1990s, fewer than 40 remained in service. Maintenance suffered. Spare parts were scarce. Sailors endured hardships that would have been unthinkable during the Soviet era. But even amidst the decline, the men who remained in service were, by all accounts, deeply committed to their duty. A new submarine, the 7th of the Oscar II class, was launched in May 1994. She was named for the largest tank battle of World War II, Kursk, and the men who crewed her were proud to serve on one of the most formidable warships ever built. Her captain, Gennady Lyachin, 45, one of the most respected officers in the Northern Fleet. His crew, 118 men, veterans alongside sailors on their first deployment. Among them was Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, 27 years old. The son of a submariner, Kolesnikov had already served aboard the Kursk for 5 years. He loved the work. He had recently married, and he had brought his new bride, Olga, to visit the ship, to show her the world he inhabited beneath the sea. On August 12, 2000, the Kursk was leading a major naval exercise, the first such large-scale exercise in over a decade. More than 30 warships, submarines, and support vessels were involved in the Barents Sea. At 8:51 local time, Captain Lyachin requested permission to begin a torpedo firing drill.
Северный флот. Запрашиваю разрешение на начало торпедных стрельб.
Northern Fleet Command granted it. The Kursk descended to periscope depth. The exercise was routine. Later that morning, at 11:28 a.m., seismic monitoring stations across Scandinavia registered an explosion in the Barents Sea. At 11:30 a.m., roughly 2 minutes after the initial blast, a far larger blast, equivalent to several tons of TNT. The Kursk sank rapidly to the seafloor, 108 meters, about 350 feet down. What caused the explosions? The answer would not come quickly, and when it did, not everyone would accept it. Because within hours of the sinking, before any wreckage had been examined, before any forensic analysis had begun, a theory took hold, one that would shape the public understanding of this disaster for years to come. And it pointed not inward at the Kursk itself, but outward at a foreign submarine. That theory is where we turn next.
On August 13, 2000, one day after the sinking, Russian officials began to publicly discuss the possibility that the Kursk had collided with a foreign submarine. Northern Fleet Commander Admiral Vyacheslav Popov stated that a collision was one of the explanations under active consideration. State media reported that SOS signals from a foreign submarine had been detected near the Kursk's position. Other former commanders, including Admiral Edward Bolton, suggested a U.S. submarine might have been involved. The theory was specific: an American or British submarine, likely monitoring the Russian naval exercise, had been operating in close proximity to the Kursk. A collision, perhaps accidental, perhaps the result of aggressive maneuvering, had caused catastrophic damage to the Russian vessel. The collision theory was not random speculation. U.S. and British submarines were known to monitor Russian naval exercises in the Barents Sea. The Cold War practice of trailing enemy submarines at close range had not ended in 1991. In fact, the American submarine USS Memphis was operating in the vicinity on the day of the disaster, actively eavesdropping on the Russian exercise. When the explosions occurred, the Memphis recorded both blasts on its sonar. It was, at the very least, a scenario that could not be dismissed. A NATO submarine operating within a few thousand meters of the Kursk, close enough perhaps for an accidental collision to have occurred, remained a live possibility.
The cause of the Kursk nuclear submarine disaster is still shrouded in mystery, with NATO rejecting initial Russian claims that a foreign submarine was to blame.
The United States Navy categorically denied any involvement. U.S. officials stated that no American vessel had been involved in any collision with the Kursk. British officials issued similar denials. But denials did not end the speculation. To many in the Russian Navy and public, the collision theory offered a more acceptable explanation than the alternative, that a Russian submarine had been destroyed by its own malfunction during a routine exercise in peacetime. The collision theory would persist for years. It would be investigated. It would be debated. And in the end, it would be weighed against a very different kind of evidence recovered from the ocean floor. We will return to that evidence. But first, there was a rescue to attempt. And inside the Kursk, in the dark, freezing aft compartments, a small group of men were still alive.
Whatever caused the Kursk to sink, the effect was catastrophic. The submarine was torn apart by two distinct explosions, 135 seconds apart. The first explosion, at 11:28 a.m., was equivalent to roughly 100 to 250 kilograms of TNT. Depending on the seismic monitoring station, it registered between 1.5 and 2.2 on the Richter scale. The second, far larger blast, at 11:45 a.m., registered over 4.0 on the Richter scale, equivalent to between 2 and 5 tons of TNT. Seismographs across Scandinavia detected both events. The forward compartments, the torpedo room, the control room, the combat information center, were obliterated. Most of the men stationed in those compartments, including Captain Liachin, were killed within seconds. But in the aft compartments, compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9, the watertight doors held, and the heavily reinforced nuclear reactor compartment stopped the force of the blast. A small group of men survived the initial explosions. Among the survivors who gathered in the stern compartment was Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, the young officer who had recently shown his wife the submarine he served on. In the pitch darkness, with the temperature barely above freezing, Kolesnikov assumed command of the survivors and began to write. He wrote by feel, unable to see the paper. His note, recovered months later, records the names of the 23 men who gathered in compartment 9. He wrote 2 messages. The first, at 13:15, was a technical log. 23 men had moved to compartment 9. They were alive. They could not escape. 2 hours later, at 15:15, he wrote again. This time, his handwriting was significantly harder to read, scrawled in total darkness, by feel alone. It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances. 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections who are now in the 9th and will attempt to get out. Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov. On the reverse side of the paper, Kolesnikov wrote a separate message, a private farewell to his wife, Olga. The two had been married only a few months. Russian officials, citing the deeply personal nature of the message, never released its contents to the public. It was given only to Olga. The note confirms that there had been an accident, but it does not specify what kind of accident. The men in compartment 9 knew the submarine had been struck by something catastrophic, but whether it came from inside or outside, they did not say. Perhaps they did not know. What they did know was that no one on the surface was coming for them. Not yet. And time was running out. Above them, on the surface, the rescue operation was beginning. And so was a political narrative that would shape how the world understood what happened to the Kursk before the physical evidence could speak. The Russian Navy's rescue effort began disastrously late. The first explosion occurred at 11:28 a.m. The Navy only realized the submarine was in trouble when it missed a scheduled communication over 6 hours later. It took them more than 16 hours to physically locate the wreckage on the ocean floor. Admiral Popov, aboard his flagship Peter the Great, initially delayed notifying the High Command. The first rescue submersible was launched at roughly 6 p.m. on August 13, over 30 hours after the initial explosion. 2 Priz-class deep submergence rescue vehicles were deployed, the AS-34 and the AS-32. These submersibles, designed in the 1980s, were meant to dock with a disabled submarine's escape hatch and transfer survivors to the surface. The first AS-34 descended. The pilot located the Kursk on sonar and maneuvered into position over the aft escape hatch. He attempted to dock. The watertight seal failed. He tried again. Failed. Multiple attempts were made. Each time, the submersible could not form a watertight connection. The batteries drained and the vehicle returned to the surface. Escape hatch interface requirements. The AS-34 submersible used a rigid docking skirt that had to meet with an undamaged hatch ring. A successful watertight seal requires both surfaces to be clean, precisely aligned, and free of deformation. Even minor warping, such as that caused by a nearby explosion or impact with the seafloor, could prevent the seal from forming. Strong underwater currents may have compounded the difficulty. A second AS-32 was launched. It encountered the same problem. Neither vehicle could dock with the Kursk. The rescue equipment, starved of maintenance funding for a decade, could not perform the mission it was designed for. As the rescue attempts continued, a parallel discussion was unfolding at the international level. Norway and Britain both offered rescue assets. Norway had deep-sea divers and specialized recovery equipment. Britain had the LR-5 rescue submersible, a far more modern craft equipped with a flexible docking skirt and sophisticated sonar, capable of mating with a submarine's escape hatch from almost any angle. Russia initially declined these offers, stating that the situation was being managed by its own forces. For several days, Russian rescue teams continued their attempts, while British and Norwegian rescue teams, already en route to Norway, their equipment loaded aboard transport aircraft without waiting for formal authorization, stood by. The new Russian president, Vladimir Putin, was at his residence in Sochi. He made his first public comments on the disaster 5 days later. A month after the sinking, in a televised interview in New York with CNN's Larry King, the journalist asked what had happened to the submarine.
Tell me, what happened with the submarine?
Putin's reply was 2 words. It sank. On August 16, 4 days after the sinking, Russia finally accepted offers of foreign assistance. President Putin formalized the agreement the following day, on August 17. The first British and Norwegian rescue teams arrived at the site on August 19.
One of the first divers to reach the Kursk was Tony Scott. He located the aft escape hatch, a prominent white-painted ring clearly visible against the dark hull. Scott and his team had been instructed to tap a prearranged code on the hull. There was no doubt the sound would carry inside if anyone was alive to hear it. Scott rested his head against the hull. He stopped breathing to listen. Every person on the support ship, divers, engineers, crew, was awake. The whole vessel held its breath, hoping for a response. Silence. Nothing. No return tap. No sign of life.
The rescuers reportedly used a simple fluid test to check if the compartment was flooded. A bottle filled with a milk-like substance, easily visible underwater, was squirted around a small equalization valve on the outer hatch. If the compartment below was dry, the vastly higher pressure outside would suck the liquid inward. If flooded, the pressure would be equal and no movement would occur. The liquid did not move. The chamber below was flooded. On August 21, 9 days after the sinking, Norwegian divers fully opened the aft escape hatch. They confirmed that the compartments were completely flooded. There was no one left to rescue. The 23 men who had gathered in compartment 9 had been dead for some time. In the first days after the sinking, Russian Navy officials reported hearing rhythmic tapping sounds, SOS signals they believed, from survivors banging on the hull. The reports gave families hope. But just as quickly, the tapping stopped. Months later, Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov offered a different account. On national television, he stated that the commission was now certain the SOS tapping could not have come from the Kursk because the submarine was not equipped with a device capable of producing such a signal. He suggested that the tapping must therefore have originated from a foreign submarine in the vicinity. Whether the taps were made by survivors banging on the hull, as many families believed, or by a mechanical device, as Klebanov maintained, has never been determined with absolute certainty. Autopsies later revealed that the survivors did not drown. The final event that killed them was a fire. An intense fire, likely caused when one of the submarine's emergency oxygen-generating canisters, filled with potassium superoxide, came into contact with the oily film on the water that was slowly rising in the compartment. Potassium superoxide, when it touches water, reacts violently, producing intense heat and pure oxygen. Dropped accidentally in the darkness by one of the struggling survivors, it would have turned the water into a blowtorch. Those who didn't die in the chemical fire suffocated when the last of the oxygen was consumed by the flames. The question of what sank the Kursk was now the subject of an active public debate. The Russian government had raised the collision theory within hours of the disaster. Admiral Popov continued to insist that a foreign vessel was involved. The United States consistently denied it. But no physical evidence had yet been examined. The Kursk was still on the seafloor. Until the submarine was raised, or at least partially recovered, the collision theory and the internal accident theory would both remain exactly that, theories. The evidence was still on the bottom of the Barents Sea, and it would stay there for over a year. In October 2001, over a year after the disaster, the Kursk was raised from the seafloor. A Dutch-led salvage consortium, working under contract with the Russian government, used a diamond-studded chain to cut off the destroyed forward torpedo room. The bow section was left on the seafloor, too damaged and too dangerous to recover. The remainder of the hull, weighing 9,600 tons even without the bow, was lifted by the barge Giant 4, one of the heaviest single-lift salvage operations in history. Inside, investigators recovered the remains of the men who had served aboard her. 115 bodies were eventually recovered and identified. 3 were never found. They recovered Kolesnikov's note, still legible in his uniform pocket. They recovered photographs, personal effects.
The families of the dead now had something to bury. But the question of what killed their sons, their husbands, their brothers, remained unsettled. The investigation was just beginning. The Russian government appointed Prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov to lead the official inquiry. His team would examine the recovered wreckage. They would analyze the damage patterns. They would listen to the acoustic recordings from monitoring stations across Scandinavia and from the USS Memphis, which had recorded both explosions from the vicinity. They would interview personnel involved in the rescue operation, naval officers, and weapons engineers. The investigation was massive. It examined numerous different working theories, including a World War II mine, sabotage, and the collision theory. And after nearly 2 years, in July 2002, Ustinov delivered his conclusion. The finding? The Kursk was destroyed not by a collision with a foreign submarine, but by a catastrophic failure of its own weapon system. A Type 6576 Kit practice torpedo, nicknamed the Fat Girl by Russian sailors, loaded into tube number 4, had leaked highly volatile hydrogen peroxide fuel. That leak triggered a chemical chain reaction that led to the initial explosion, and ultimately to the detonation of the remaining torpedoes. The collision theory was officially over. But many in Russia did not accept the verdict. And they had reasons, some grounded in genuine questions about the evidence, others in the political context of a nation that had seen its military humiliated by a decade of decline. We will weigh both sides next. Russian sailors called the Type 6576 Kit torpedo Tolstushka, the Fat Girl. It weighed 4,500 kilograms. It was 11 meters long. Its HTP propulsion system gave it unmatched speed and range. But as we will see, that same fuel made it as dangerous to its own crew as it was to any enemy. This was, in effect, a bomb powered by its own fuel. The practice torpedo did not carry a live warhead, but the HTP fuel itself was the explosive. High-test peroxide propulsion. Hydrogen peroxide at concentrations above 85% is extremely volatile. When it contacts kerosene fuel, rubber seals, or lubricants, it decomposes explosively, producing superheated steam and pure oxygen. The gas expands 5,000 to 1. A single liter of liquid HTP can produce 5,000 liters of high-pressure gas and steam in under a second. The official investigation identified a specific mechanical failure, a faulty weld in the casing of that same Type 6576 Kit torpedo. That weld failed under pressure, leaking high-test peroxide into the sealed torpedo tube. And according to the investigation, the leak had been caused by something as small as a single imperfect weld. The Russian Navy had been aware of the risks associated with HTP torpedoes for years. Internal safety reports had flagged the volatility of the peroxide. Both the British and American navies had experimented with peroxide torpedoes in the 1950s and early 1960s, and both had abandoned them as too dangerous. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, continued to use them. The Type 65 remained in service because of its unmatched performance, speeds approaching 50 knots over ranges exceeding 50 kilometers. No electric torpedo could match it. No aircraft carrier could outrun it. The investigation's conclusion was supported by physical evidence, and that evidence contradicted the collision theory in specific, measurable ways. Damage pattern analysis. A submerged collision between two submarines produces distinctive bilateral damage, crushing and scraping on both vessels at the impact zone, consistent with external force. The Kursk's damage profile, documented by the salvage team, was primarily internal. The outer hull, while breached by the second explosion, did not exhibit a continuous crush pattern from an external impact. The destruction radiated outward from inside tube number 4, a damage vector consistent with an internal detonation. The Norwegian seismic data, combined with the acoustic recordings from the USS Memphis, further supported the internal explosion conclusion.
The two distinct blasts, separated by 135 seconds, followed a pattern consistent with an initial HTP detonation followed by an ammunition cook-off, a sequence difficult to reconcile with a single collision event. The finding: the Kursk was destroyed not by a collision with a foreign submarine, but by a catastrophic failure of its own weapon system. A Type 6576 Kit practice torpedo, nicknamed the Fat Girl by Russian sailors, loaded into tube number 4, had leaked highly volatile hydrogen peroxide fuel. That leak triggered a chemical chain reaction that led to the initial explosion, and ultimately to the detonation of the remaining torpedoes. The collision theory was officially over, but many in Russia did not accept the verdict, and they had reasons, some grounded in genuine questions about the evidence, others in the political context of a nation that had seen its military humiliated by a decade of decline. One of those reasons was this: the investigation, for all its thoroughness, could not achieve total forensic certainty. The forward torpedo room, the compartment most likely to contain evidence of a collision, was too heavily damaged to reconstruct. Neither the Russian government nor the United States Navy has released the full acoustic recordings from the exercise area. The USS Memphis, which recorded the event in real time from the vicinity, could theoretically provide additional data, but its logs remain classified. This evidentiary gap, however small, has been enough for the collision theory to persist. Many in the Russian naval establishment continue to believe a NATO submarine was involved. The theory's most vocal champion is the man who commanded the fleet that day, Admiral Popov. 2 decades after the disaster, Popov doubled down. In a 2021 interview, he stated on the record that he could name the specific NATO submarine involved with 90% certainty.
Подводная лодка, которая столкнулась с Курском, следила за Курском, видимо. 90% знаю наименование ее.
His version of events is highly detailed. He alleges a foreign boat was actively trailing the Kursk, got too close, and collided.
Глубоко убежден, что это была иностранная подводная лодка.
Popov claims the NATO submarine was damaged by the impact and the subsequent torpedo cook-off, but managed to restart its engines and limp away toward a base off the coast of Norway, briefly tracked by Russian anti-submarine aircraft. Following the disaster, the Pentagon and the British Ministry of Defense rejected Russian requests to inspect their submarines operating in the region, stating all vessels were unharmed and fully accounted for. Popov admits he does not have the physical proof to back up his narrative. The collision theory has endured not because the recovered wreckage supports it, but because the classified nature of the event means the physical record cannot categorically, absolutely, without a single remaining doubt, rule it out. And in that gap between what the evidence shows and what the evidence can prove beyond all possible doubt, the debate lives on. The Kursk was scrapped in 2002. The forward torpedo room, the site of the initial explosion, was deemed too dangerously loaded with unexploded ordnance to recover and too classified to abandon. In September 2002, the Russian Navy deliberately detonated explosive charges on the seafloor, obliterating what remained of the bow, the unexploded weapons, and the evidence. Today, a monument stands in Murmansk, incorporating the actual salvaged sail of the submarine, unveiled in 2009. 118 names are carved in stone. The Kursk disaster is about chemistry and physics. It is about a torpedo propulsion system that carried inherent risk that was documented, understood, and never fully addressed. It is about the extreme environment in which submariners operate and the razor-thin margin between a routine exercise and a mass casualty event. It is also about 23 men who gathered in a darkened compartment at the rear of their submarine, who wrote notes, who waited, who hoped, who ultimately died not from the explosion itself, but from a secondary chemical fire in the very compartment they had hoped would keep them alive. The note left by Dmitry Kolesnikov, written in pitch darkness, by feel, as the air grew colder and the water rose,
remains one of the most powerful documents in modern naval history.
In the weeks and months that followed the disaster, families of the crew demanded answers. During one official meeting in the naval town of Vidyayevo, a grieving mother, Nadezhda Telik, whose son, a senior lieutenant, was among the dead, interrupted Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov as he attempted to explain the accident. Her frustration, shared by so many of the relatives in that room, overwhelmed her. A medic approached and administered a sedative through her coat. The moment, captured on camera, shocked Russia. It became a symbol of the raw grief that the official explanations could not address. In the aftermath, several senior officers were dismissed. Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, the Northern Fleet commander who had presided over the failed rescue operation and is the most vocal champion of the collision theory, was relieved of command. Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov, who had likewise steadfastly promoted the collision theory as head of the government investigation, was also dismissed. The official investigation had provided its answers, but for many families, those answers were insufficient. Following the disaster, the Russian Navy removed HTP-fueled torpedoes from service. Other navies reviewed their own weapon safety protocols. NATO and Russia began to participate in joint submarine rescue exercises. International standards for escape hatches were improved. Lessons were learned, at a cost no one would have chosen to pay. Questions remain. The official investigation provided its answers, but the full acoustic records from that day have never been released by all parties. The forward torpedo room, what was left of it after the Russian Navy destroyed it with explosive charges on the seafloor in September 2002, will never yield its evidence. The collision theory, contradicted by the physical evidence, yet not absolutely disproven by the incomplete record, persists.